Hey everybody, welcome back to AJ 118. If you recall, this is going to be part two of chapter 13, where we were covering the challenge of gangs. And we had just finished up talking about some signs that you might see, indicators, if you remember, on gangs moving into the area. And we talked about graffiti and drive-by shootings, intimidation, assaults, murders, open sale of drugs. Graffiti is a really good one because you'll really see that on your patrol beat as you're driving around. We talked about more shootings and looking at the fact, is the victim a gang member or not, or a suspected gang member or what have you. And depending upon which gang it is, you can start to figure out who might be feuding with who. The same way that you can look at graffiti and you'll be able to tell that. So as we look at a couple of different ways to tell that there is gang activity in your town, again, you can look at the name. So we talked about knowing, turf, like here 155th Street. So you can kind of look at that. Here you have Palmer Block, Crips. So Compton Palmer Block. And then remember, they cross out like the P's for Pyru, because they want the C's, they want the Crip. So they're gonna cross out anything else that has to do with Pyrus or Bloods. And then the same way over here, a lot of times you'll see stuff that's X'd out, which means it's very disrespectful, which means that it's a possibility of a drive-by or a homicide. But again, anything that you see X'd out might have a relationship with a different gang, which is why they're going to X it out. So let's talk about now identifying gang members, but also looking at characteristics and how you may be able to spot somebody. So once communities recognize that they have a gang problem, the next step really is to identify the members themselves. And while gang identifiers vary from, school to school, community to community, etc., there are some that are just easy to spot and those that are always useful. One would be graffiti. Looking for monikers or different things, or tattoos. These are indicators. Maybe gang literature, initiations, people getting jumped in, calls of fights coming in. So this is one way to identify gang members. Their hand signs, their colors, and even their behavior. I have a really interesting video that I'm not going to show you now because I need to get through the rest of the lecture, but there's a video link here to a clip called Rites of Passage, and it shows how one individual ends up getting jumped into the gang. If I have time, I'll come back to it, but I may not. Some other identifying things could be symbols. Things like gang symbols are very common. So a symbol could be clothing, the color, hand signs could, depending upon, the two C's could be Compton Crip with the hand sign. Graffiti, tattoos, colors, all of these are symbols that are characteristic of gang members. And even looking at, it's not going to tell you everything, but the blue color, sometimes the belt buckle might have the first letter of whatever gang it is, or whether it's north or south or east or west, or G for gang, so NLG. Easy to spot colors, when red, we talked about the different colors there. It could be just a red baseball cap. Most gang members don't wear a scarf around their face like this. They'll put it in their back pocket and have part of it sticking out, or they'll have it over the top of their head, kind of like a hat, but they don't wear it like a bank robber typically, like you're going to see in that photo right there. We talked about hand signs. Almost always, gang members will have a hand sign that will, identify them as where they are from, where's their turf, what gang they're in, etc. We talked about graffiti again, and you can tell, Sage Street. So this is South Side Sage Street in Rialto. Why they put gang, I don't know, but anyway, it is what it is. Tattoos, a lot of times, are very good indicators of both current and former gang membership. So if you looked at this prison tattoo on an individual, what do you see right here? You'll see an inmate behind bars choking a prison guard. Okay, so you just may want to be a little bit more alert on your guard when you're dealing with this individual, knowing that he has this particular tattoo and that he could be a prison gang member, and what his past is like. Sometimes the tattoos are very straightforward when you look at the top of this guy's head. Other times you'll be able to tell if they've done time in prison based on what they have. Yard, meaning like prison yard. Here's the bars, and here's his prison number, his identification number. So you can tell that this individual did some time in prison. So these are all things for you to look at. So now that we've kind of looked at recognizing the presence of gangs and identifying some gang members and some different characteristics of those, let's talk a little bit about intelligence gathering, the police response to gangs. So often police chiefs in cities where gangs have recently arrived are slow to recognize the threat. And if police chiefs deny a gang problem despite the mounting evidence, the gang problem may become unmanageable. However, if police acknowledge the existence of gangs, this places the police administration kind of in a realm where they really need to take care of the issues that they're starting to see coming forth. An important task, therefore, in most police departments is gathering information or intelligence on gangs and their members. Now, intelligence is knowing what gangs are out there, where they are, the names of the individual gang members and their affiliation, where they've been seen and who they have been seen with. And that's really important for us to know. So in this intelligence gathering umbrella here, again, names of the individual gang members, where they have been seen, who they have been seen with. There's a lot of other sharing systems out there that we have. We have the gang intelligence system. We have the regional information sharing system. We have the general reporting, evaluation, and tracking, or the GREAT system, which helps us track gangs. It's a computerized gang intelligence system in order to help us do that. So information and intelligence on gangs is vital then. And this includes things like internal contacts with officers and detectives. And these are things where you can find gang intelligence. Records or computerized files, maybe even in police reports. Interviews with gang members, that's a lot of good information out there. Surveillance activities, paid or unpaid informants, information from other law enforcement agencies, and then we've talked about this already, but social network. These are all great ways to find information and intelligence on gangs. So there's a list, but social networking sites is really important because a lot of gangs are involved. They have the technology and they're using it. And if I were to show you this picture right here, what does this picture show you? Or what do you think when you see this photo? So I'm going to tell you kind of a really cool thing. So on the investigative side, typically when there's a gang funeral, those that are in the gang are going to come to the service in order to pay their respects. And they may not be all flashing gang signs or whatever, but they are certainly going to show up, and they're going to show up in the cars that they drive. And it's going to be both, hardcore gang members in the gang, and maybe even some affiliates, and maybe even some families. So what these allow on the investigative end is a good opportunity for law enforcement to get license plates of all of these vehicles, to take pictures of them together as a group, should we need to testify later on that they're all involved in the same gang, and to be able to identify other individuals within the gang. So these pictures are very, very important. Another great form of gang intelligence would be things like gang cards or booking photos or even jail classifications. Now, when a gang card is basically like a field interview card where maybe you don't have enough to arrest somebody, but you want to put their information in the computer because they're in an area that they shouldn't be in. They're suspicious. You thought they were involved in criminal activity, etc. They're not being arrested. You're just filling out this card and putting it inside of the data in a computer system. So if something does happen, we know later on. Booking photos you would take when somebody is arrested. There would be a picture, and you would be able to use that booking photo later to show that the person, what they were arrested for, what type of crime, etc. Well, the interesting thing here is that when somebody gets arrested also, there's something called a jail classification. And what that means is when they're not just going to put someone who claims to be in a gang with any gang because they don't want to get them injured or killed. So they're going to ask them a series of questions. And here is a kind of a copy of a inmate classification form. And this is some of the questions that they ask. They ask about arrest history and drugs and violence and etc. But then over here, they ask you gang involvement. And if it adds up to a certain amount of points, then they're going to be either high-profile prisoner or maybe not so high-profile. But what we're looking for is, because when a gang member goes to jail, they want to make sure they're put with the right individuals, not in general population and just anywhere. So they will admit a lot of times. So name of gang, East Side Santa Paula, 12th Street. His nickname is Rambo. Pretty cool. And here are some tattoos. So if I needed to prove that this person, say the person got arrested for some crime and I wanted to charge him with a gang enhancement later on, I could come back and get a copy of this inmate classification form that says that this guy is a gang member. And he told us that. We didn't make it up. It's what he said. Oh, and by the way, he even signed it. So these are important. So you can look a little bit closer when it talks about gang involvement. Self-admitted. He told us this was the gang. He has some tattoos. All right. A little bit on updated case laws when it comes to gang cards. California Gang Database did have some errors and some entries and things like that. So there is a bill out there. It's AB 2298 and PC 186.34. That would require law enforcement agencies submitting a document to the Attorney General's office for the purpose of designating a person a gang member, etc. We don't just designate everybody as a gang member. Another characteristic of a gang would be their organization. Although many gangs are kind of loosely structured, some are very formally organized. If a gang's organization can be visualized by a bullseye, at the center are the more dedicated hardcore members with the others on the outside. Remember, the average age is early to mid-20s. There are some gang members, they call them wannabes. They kind of dress and act like gang members, but they're really not, in a sense. Again, leadership, in some gangs, leadership is very well defined, and maybe one of three types. It could be a key personality, a chain of command type leadership, or collective. We look at the target again. Those in the center are the hardcore gang members. and then the kind of less hardcore and wannabes and stuff kind of on the outside, etc. That's one way to look at it. But if you want to know more specifically, when you talk about gangs, there's a reason that we chart these gangs, and we have our crime analysis unit put these things together so we know who is who and who's in charge. And if we're looking for serving search warrants on, let's say, the Mexican mafia, like right here, then we know that all of these individuals are involved in the Mexican mafia, or at least have been identified. And this will tell you where some of these particular persons are. This is a less sophisticated one. So we talked about motorcycle gangs. Remember, we said they had different chapters. So the Vagos motorcycle gang, this is basically a link chart is what we call it, to link all the affiliates together. So here's the international chapter of the Vagos. Then you have Hollywood and Orange and Venice and Pasadena and Compton. And these are the individuals that are involved in each of these type chapters. So we're linking them all together so we know who is who. This is our intel. Here's a basic chart for a smaller gang in Compton called South Los. And here you can see that Triste, Riley Hurtado, he was killed. And again, see, these are the monikers. This is so we keep track of who the soldiers are and who's in this gang. These are known associates. So we know here that Bullet is one of the heads up here. But I like the nicknames like, Shorty. How'd you like that? Shorty, really? Overdose, Little Bird, Stranger. I mean, just kind of all the, Juero, all the different names. But those are the nicknames. How about Cartoon? I don't even know what that, Okay. But anyway, there's a nickname for a reason. Remember, that's their moniker. Even a smaller gang, Southside Rialto. We know that, let's say that Southside Rialto does a shooting and we're looking for the gun, and we know that gang members pass the gun around, so so law enforcement doesn't know where it is. If we can link all these people together, then we can do a search warrant at all of these houses looking for the gun. Does that make sense? So that's why we do these charts linking each person with each person. So all of these people are directly involved in that particular gang. Here's another one called 4 Block. And we're linking all of these individuals together so we can do search warrants if we have to, if they decide to commit a crime or something like that. So again, kind of an interesting thing. So now that we've kind of gone through some of that, let's again go back a little bit to the police response and look for some strategies, some more strategies for dealing with gang problems. One could be suppression. And that is a strategy to address the gang problem that includes tactics like prevention, arrest, imprisonment, supervision, surveillance. We could do social intervention. This is a strategy to address the gang problem that includes things like crisis intervention or treatment for youth and families or outreach or social services. So those are some options there too. Social opportunity, that's a strategy to address the gang problem that includes providing basic or remedial education, training, work incentive, and job opportunities. Could be community mobilization. That's a strategy to address the gang problem that includes improved communication and joint policy and program development among justice, community-based, and other organizations. So you can see all of these different types of strategies to deal with the gang problem. Organizational development. This is a law enforcement strategy to address the gang problem that includes special police units and special youth agency crisis programs. So here is a very interesting thing that you're starting to see now in a lot of police departments called the Reentry Support Team. This is RRST, so it's the Rialto Reentry Support Team. And what this does is it supports individuals that are coming out of prison to help them get services that they need so they don't just rotate back into prison. So it could be workforce development and behavioral health or drug abuse or faith-based or legal or DMV or vocational. All of those things, they meet together like once a month And all of these services come to these meetings and try to help these individuals out. So again, a really important strategy. But kind of back to the gang problem under suppression. Suppression really is the traditional police response. And suppression, by definition, is a strategy to address the gang problem. Remember, that includes tactics such as prevention, arrest, imprisonment, supervision, and surveillance. So, we have a suppression component. That's one. We have an intervention component, and then we have a prevention component. And these are good traditional responses, all three of them. Back in the olden days when I was working in Rialto, our gang unit was called SCAT. If you look that up in the dictionary, it's, not really good. But anyway, it's called the Street Crime Attack Team, and we drove these really cool all black cars, and the officers wore all the black uniforms. But you are starting to see gang units forming. So to combat the gang problem, departments are coming up with, and they all have now, full service gang units. And they use those components of prevention, suppression, and intervention. So that's kind of what a gang unit looks like. But again, it's there for to be specifically trained on how to deal with all these different types of things. Okay, a couple other things that I want you to know before we're done today. One would be what we call in California is the STEP Act. And that's a short acronym for Street Terrorism Enforcement Protection Act. It's under California Penal Code Section 18622. It was enacted by legislature in 1988. It's been a California law for over 20 years now. And basically, here's what it says. The legislature, etc., finds that the state of California is in a state of crisis, which has been caused by violent street gangs whose members threaten, terrorize, and commit a multitude of crimes against the peaceful citizens of their neighborhoods, etc. And then these gang activities present a clear and present danger to the public order and safety and are not constitutionally protected. So what the STEP Act does is it specifically targets gang members. It targets those who help gang members commit crimes. And the person doesn't have to be a gang member if they're assisting a gang member in a crime. So if you commit a crime for the benefit of, the direction of, or in association with a gang, there is an enhancement. And that's typically the STEP Act. There's a video that you can watch, but it hits them a little bit harder. So here's a couple of newspaper clippings. And what these are, what the STEP Act is, it also is known as like a gang injunction, and we'll talk a little bit about that. Rialto was one of the first departments in the Inland Empire to serve a court order against gangs, making it a crime for them to associate with each other. So here we have a clip, DA takes on Rialto gang. And it talks about filing, asks the court for an injunction against these gang members to stop hanging out, drinking, committing crimes, etc. And if they're in that neighborhood doing what they're not supposed to be doing, we can arrest them simply for flying their colors or hanging out together, etc. So kind of an interesting thing. We talked about suppression. Here's another article, says agencies team up for sweep. 16 people arrested as 171 officers help in a raid. So kind of an interesting thing. So 171 cops banded together from different agencies to, it says here in the article, to rustle its members out of bed, the gangs, while serving a series of search warrants called Operation Busta Squad. Well, the name of the gang was Hustler Squad, so they came up with a name, but they served all these search warrants looking for wanted suspects, firearms used in crimes, drugs, etc. Here's another article, again, about sweeping the streets when it comes to gang enforcement. and using SWAT teams and some of those suppression tactics. At one point, we ended up going after the Mexican mafia. So, and then, another article talking about taking the neighborhoods back by serving search warrants and using some of these suppression tactics. Police target areas plagued with gangs because we know gangs and drugs go together. Here are another series of search warrants. Officers serve 81 warrants, make 53 arrests. So pretty cool. So more than 100 officers came together, arresting 53 alleged drug dealers and other criminal suspects during a sweep that followed a 6-month narcotic investigation. So again, guns, drugs, gangs, all kind of connected. In this particular sweep, 31 guns we found, and 2 of those that we found were used in homicides in Rialto and San Bernardino. So that's why there's this suppression component here. Okay, so with all of that now, so we have a really pretty good thorough idea. What are some difficulties? So we know the characteristics, we know where they hang out, we know what they do, we know about gang suppression and all that other stuff, but when it comes to prosecution, how easy is it? Well, there are some difficulties when it comes to prosecuting. One could be that victims and witnesses really don't want to cooperate. They're kind of reluctant. And, the second one could be is that a lot of people think, well, it's futile, to cooperate because they're just going to get out, or you're not going to keep them in jail or whatever. Some fear personal harm or gang intimidation and fear of reprisal, meaning the gang's going to come back after them. The other thing when it comes to prosecuting gang members is a lot of times you have a gang on gang crime, so the witnesses, they're not that credible because they're gang members themselves. So that makes it difficult. And then the last one is really important. Inadequate police reports, which means the officer's investigation and the report wasn't up to par, which is why I always say in my classes that report writing is super, super important in order to get your cases prosecuted properly. So what are some federal efforts now that we know some of those things that, we talk about state prosecution? Well, we do have the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have the FBI with Safe Streets, Violent Crime Initiative. We have the National Crime Prevention Council that covers the Anti-Gang Initiative. We have the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention that helps us put together a comprehensive gang model. Again, some other strategies, some more local strategies would be establishing things like behavior codes, or establishing drug-free zones, implementing conflict prevention strategies or community pressure. The 2 that I have bold are really important. One is obtaining a civil injunction. Remember I talked about that gang injunction? It's where once you define a gang and who's in it, you serve them all a civil summons. And basically what it is you take them to court so they can't keep hanging out with each other and causing problems. And then you can have, graffiti removal programs. So when they spray up their graffiti, your removal program comes right back around and sprays off the graffiti so that way people don't see it. Here's an article that was back in 2012, Rialto gang that terrorized apartment complex targeted by injunctions. So a gang injunction by definition is kind of a restraining order against a group. It's a civil suit that seeks a court order declaring the gang basically a public nuisance and asking for special rules directed towards its activity. And injunctions can address the neighborhood's gang problem before it reaches the level of felony crime. So if they're hanging out, drinking, throwing their gang signs, intimidating, we can help deal with that through these gang injunctions. And gang injunctions clearly have a demonstrable positive effect on the neighborhood area that's covered. Some have had a really good effect. In smaller areas, gang nuisance activity can be permanently removed. It's not foolproof, but it is a good thing. So here's a couple of photos to show you this is how we serve them. We go to their house and we serve them with an actual court order. on what they're not allowed to do anymore. They can't hang out with their gang buddies. They can't drink. They can't do this in public in front of all these places, etc. Here's an example of the safety zone. When we talk about a certain area that they can't hang out in. So this was a gang injunction against the Hustler Squad, and it covers this area in this outline. So they have to stay out of there. Factors that motivate gangs. Well, we talked about why people join gangs, but some factors that might motivate it could be the need for a safe haven, the need for a recruitment, the community's ability to provide important information, and even some psychological factors. So these are all things that motivate a gang. And the approach to dealing with gangs is in fact a community problem. It's not just a law enforcement problem, because all affected parties must engage in finding a solution. And it might be this big mobilization process where you're involving community leaders and forming a task force and conducting risk and resource assessments, and then planning the program and deciding, the evaluation methods that you're going to do. So there are different approaches, but it's not just a law enforcement problem. A couple of successful programs would be places like Homeboy Industries, where there's jobs, where you're preparing someone for the future. And Homeboy Industries actually not only does it employ former gang members, but it also helps them get their tattoos removed, if that's something that they want to do. Because imagine getting out and going into the general population of people and having tattoos that aren't, that are gang related, or maybe on your chin or face or whatever, and you want to get those removed so you kind of, can move on with your life. Not everybody does it, but they do offer that as something. So I know that was kind of long, but we're going to end with part 2 right here. I would highly suggest that if you have time and you want to, you don't have to, go back and look at some of those videos, those links that I posted. I think you'll find them extremely interesting. So in summary, we know that prevention efforts should begin early and target youth exposed to these multiple risk factors, and address all facets of that young person's life. Community mobilization was found to be one of the most effective strategies to address the gang problem, and community ambivalence toward gangs exists for many reasons. So that'll be the end of our lecture for Chapter 13, Part 2, and stay tuned for which chapter we are going to cover next. But until we meet online again.